Hello, I'm Jay Spehar. I'm an independent mining historian from the Globe Miami area. I've been working on mining history for the last several decades, actually, and I've done a lot of it in the Globe Miami district. The type of mining history that I've worked on is technology, management, production, and labor. I guess I do have to say that my favorite areas that I like to work in have to do with labor and management, primarily because they are people-based. History isn't about people, then what's the point? I've been in the Globe Miami area now for 33 years. I worked in the local copper mining industry all of that time. Retired here just a few years ago. After I retired, I was able to go back to my avocation, which is history, and I have been pursuing that since that time. If you're interested in history, there are many local resources available to you. One of those resources is the room that we're seated in today, which is the mining room at the Miami Memorial Library. As you can see, it is just chock full of historic mining books and documents of various kinds. If you're interested in mining history, I'd urge you to come here and visit this facility. It is a world-class collection. There are also resources available at museums, the Bullion Plaza Museum and Cultural Center, as well as the Globe Museum, where they have a very good mining collection also. So those are resources that are available to anyone with interest in local mining history, as well as national and even international mining history. One of the areas that I have been working on the last few years is the World War II era, and it has to do with the role of labor during the war. I have here an article that was published in the Arizona History Journal back in the fall of, I have to look, it all flies by, 2018, autumn 2018 edition. The title of this article is Keeping the Wartime Labor Peace, and it deals with copper, discrimination in the workplace, and what we call the warfare state. Not the welfare state, the warfare state. And what that term means is the whole apparatus of government that was created just before and during the Second World War, and a big part of that was focused on labor. The story told in this article is really about the fight for minority inclusion in the economic hierarchy of the copper mining industry. There existed a dual wage system that went way back to 19th century, and as it evolved, as history evolved, the Globe Miami district became the epicenter of the struggle to eliminate workplace discrimination in the copper industry. Globe Miami has a long and rich labor history. And the first union was organized in Globe in 1884. A couple years later, there was a significant strike at the Old Dominion Company. Why? Well, because new management at the Old Dominion Company brought in Mexican workers, and they were willing to work cheaper than the Anglo workers, and that led to the strike. And as it turns out, the existing workforce prevailed in that. And Globe was known as a white camp, meaning that most of the workers there were Anglos. They came from Northern Europe, Western Europe for the most part. But as time went on, things were changing in the district. As the Miami side of the district came online, huge mines with thousands of employees. A large number of those employees were Hispanic, Slavic, Italian. They not that there weren't some of those at the Old Dominion, but it changed. At Miami changed the complexion, the demographic complexion of the mining district. By the time of World War I, 1917, strikes plagued the copper industry, And after the war, the labor movement found itself in disarray. Globe Miami unions were no exception. The union movement basically was moribund from 1917, 1918, until the New Deal in the mid-30s. At that point, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, passed the National Labor Relations Act, and the National Labor Relations Board was implemented to enforce the act. That basically jump-started labor in the Globe Miami district, and union elections were held. New unions were then certified. These unions then went on in time through the Second World War and beyond. The main union at the time was what we call mine mill, or the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers. It became the advocate for workers who were suffering from workplace discrimination in wages and job access, which had many barriers that kept minority workers from moving into those job positions. Roosevelt administration implemented two executive orders that are quite important. One is related to the outline of workplace discrimination in defense industries and government agencies, and the other one, a National War Labor Board and a non-ferrous metals commission for taking on the role of what the civilian agencies had done before the war. The first executive order also created what we call the FEPC, or the Fair Employment Practices Committee. That committee, investigative agency, it quickly opened an office in El Paso, Texas, and investigated employers in the southwestern United States. An important employer, of course, was the copper mining industry. The FEPC investigation found widespread discrimination based on race and segregation throughout communities, and the local Globe Miami copper companies were no exception. And it would also be important to point out that they were not the only entity that was accused of workplace discrimination. That was true right across the employment profile of the southwestern United States. Once Mine Mill was certified, they quickly filed charges with the Non-Ferrous Metals Commission, which was an overseeing agency for the copper mining industry, filed charges claiming that they were subject to racism, discrimination in the workplace, a dual wage system, barriers that prevented minority people from having access to their better positions in the workforce. The investigation that resulted from that found, as did the FEPC investigation, racial discrimination, widespread segregation throughout the community, wage system and job access barriers, and it concluded, basically based on data that it forced the industry to turn over to the government. Based on that data, it concluded that any daily wage below $6.36 was indeed connected to discrimination and even racial discrimination, because when they looked at the data, they found that 95% of the people occupying the lowest paid positions in the mining district were in fact Hispanic, Black, people of color, or minority people. The industry, of course, objected to that finding, and they had lots of arguments for why that wasn't a valid conclusion, and they appealed the finding as well as the implementation that the Non-Ferrous Metals Commission had recommended for new wage scales. They appealed that finding to the National War Labor Board. Interestingly, the War Labor Board refused to overturn Non-Ferrous Metal Commission's finding, let it stand, and did not make a finding of racism in the workplace. This, of course, was vindication from the company's point of view, and from the union's point of view, it was a somewhat bitter defeat. The 60-year battle of inclusion within the industry, however, was not over, and it would continue for another 20 years. The war was over, beware the peace. That was the message of the unions at the end of World War II. The next thing that was noteworthy in this case occurred when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. Following the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1966, the union filed several complaints with the Employment Opportunity Commission, and they conducted investigations of the companies and their employment practices. And finally, in 1970, Attorney General John Mitchell of Nixon administration fame directed the Department of Justice to file a lawsuit against one of the local companies, Inspiration Consolidated Copper Company, as a test case that would affect the entire industry. So it isn't as though Inspiration was singled out as the sole bad guy. Again, they're a test case for the industry. In 1973, a court ruling was issued in the federal courthouse, downtown Globe, upstairs of the post office, in which they determined that there was indeed discrimination occurring. There were job barriers, artificial job barriers in place that affected especially Native American and Mexican workers. That, in 1973, really marked the beginning of the end of workplace discrimination, job access barriers in the copper mining industry, and it opened a new era for these companies to retool the way they handled their personnel, their hiring practices, job descriptions, and wage scales, and indeed made a much better industry for its workers and the communities that it operated in as time went on. Thank you.